In the frozen silence of Montana's mountains, veteran Jack Turner thought he had buried the chaos of war. But during a deadly snowstorm, he discovered a wounded German shepherd mother and her two fragile pups fighting for life in the drifts. He saved them. But in doing so, he uncovered scars that told of cruelty, menacing strangers lurking in the forest, and a past Bella the mother was running from. What followed was not just survival, but a battle for loyalty and redemption. If this story moves you, please like this video and subscribe for more heartfelt journeys. Jack Turner had learned to measure winters the way some men measure time. Not by dates, but by the way wind hunts along a ridge and how snow packs into the seams of a cabin door. On the third day of the storm, when the drifts rose to his knees and the sky turned the color of pewter, the veteran pulled on his old field parka and stepped into the white. The wind pressed against him like a living thing. His breath turned to steam and whipped away as he crossed the yard toward the woodshed, each step breaking a crust of ice with a soft, brittle crack. The world held no color except the brown of his barn and the black stringer pines along the ravine. He was alone on his 6 acres of Idaho high country, alone by choice. Yet even then he felt that old field sense, the one that tightened his back when something in the air changed. He reached the shed and lifted the creaking latch. Splitting rounds waited under a tarp rimed with frost. He stacked an armful and paused, listening, not with his ears, but with the part of him that had listened for mortars and distant engines in a different life. At first he thought the wind was playing its old tricks, pulling a whistle through the eaves. Then he heard it again, thin, high, and close, a sound that didn't belong to weather. He set the wood down and killed his breath to hear past the gale. There, a drawn-out cry breaking into little gasps. It wasn't human. It had the tremble of fear and the rasp of effort. The sound came from the tree line beyond the old fence where the land fell toward the ravine. Jack pulled his scarf higher swept snow from the flashlight lens with his thumb and waded out. The drift at the fence came to his thighs. He leaned a shoulder, pushed through, and landed in the lee where the wind died to a hiss. The sound came again, more urgent. He moved along the fence line light, slashing across blown snow and bent grass until the beam caught a scrap of color in the white, brown, and gray clumped with ice. He knelt. What looked like a fallen branch was a body pressed into the snowbank ribs, lifting shallowly. A German shepherd female lay there, one side stained a dark, terrible red that had frozen in petals along her fur. Against her chest, 2 small shapes shivered, noses, buried paws, twitching, the fight in them nearly gone. The mother lifted her head at the light. Her eyes were the amber of old whiskey ringed with frost. She tried to growl. It came out as a whisper. Jack put his gloved hand palm down on the snow. Easy, girl. The pups gave tiny, surprised sounds at the timbre of a human voice. He saw how ice had clumped into the fur around their noses and how the mother's flank was matted, a cut sliced from hip to ribs. A loop of frayed rope lay half buried under her neck, frozen stiff like a cruel collar. She must have run until she could not run. Jack glanced back toward the cabin, a dim shape through a white veil. Distance that would be nothing in June now looked like a mile of ocean. He studied the bank. If he lifted the mother wrong, the wound would open. He shrugged off his parka, spread it in the snow, slid his arms beneath her as a medic would, mindful of the ribs, the breath, the skin pulled tight by cold. She stiffened, then stilled eyes never leaving his. He set her gently onto the parka, bundled the edges up around her to keep the wound from the wind, and lifted. She was lighter than his memory of shepherds from base gates, lighter than a healthy dog should be. The pups he cupped inside his sweater against his chest, their tiny hearts tapping his skin like frantic wings. He took the hill in slow steps, boots plunging and dragging, breath going raw. Twice he stopped to rest her weight on his thigh and talk to her over the howl. Almost home, girl. Stay with me. The porch steps were half lost under a drift. He kicked a foothold, backed through the door with his shoulder, and felt the old hinges give with a wooden sigh. Heat hit him in a tired pulse from the wood stove. He eased the Mother Bella he named her without thinking onto a folded wool blanket before the stove and unwrapped the parka. The pups slid free of his sweater and curled into the warm hollow by her belly, whimpering with a life that frightened itself back to the surface. Jack moved in the tight, practiced circle of someone who had steadied bleeding before. He warmed a bowl of water with a touch of broth, set it down, and watched Bella's tongue flick weakly, then drink with careful sips, as if each one had to be counted. He found clean towels, the old first aid kit, and shears. The rope around her neck had frozen into a hard oval. He slipped 2 fingers beneath, felt the rubbed skin and the tender heat of infection, and worked the blade until the rope parted. The cut along her flank wasn't deep, but it was long and dirty, as if she'd caught herself on barbed wire or broken metal. He breathed through his nose to keep his hands steady and flushed the wound with warm saline, letting the pink water run onto a towel. Bella's eyes held his. He told her what he was doing not because she needed the words, but because he did. When he stitched 3 small sutures to close the worst of it, she did not cry out. The pups' bellies rising with new warmth dreamed little dream twitches, paws paddling as if chasing something they believed they could finally catch. He refilled the stove, hung his parka by the fire to dry, and sank back on his heels. The cabin had changed without moving. Square corners softened. The tick of heat in the stovepipe sounded companionable. He remembered a night in Kandahar when his medic had sat in the dirt and stitched a private's arm with the same quiet focus, the same words of comfort offered into wind and grit. Back then, he had felt the astonishing shock of gratitude for hands that worked and did not question. He felt it now reversed, like a tide coming home. Bella tested her front legs, found she could shift her weight, and nudged one pup with her nose. The little one he'd call the bold-faced boy Max, the pale-socked girl, Daisy, latched onto a tepid mixture of goat's milk he'd warmed on the stove. Jack had no goat's milk. He had powdered milk for baking and a memory of ratios from a ranch hand job 30 years back. He improvised, added a bit of honey, thinned it, and watched their mouths work with greedy efficiency. When he reached to lift Daisy for another sip, Bella lifted a paw and laid it over his wrist, not to stop him, but to feel where his hand went. Trust wasn't a light switch. It was a dimmer slide, notched by the hour. Night gathered early, outside blizzard light, becoming a blue that seeped under the door and through the window frames. Jack set a chair between the stove and the door and took the first watch of a watch no one had ordered him to take. The storm beat on the glass and rattled the stovepipe. Now and then Bella lifted her head to listen, ears flicking, then laid it down again. When the wind found a new seam and groaned, the pups startled and burrowed deeper into the blanket's valley. Jack sipped coffee, gone lukewarm, and counted their breaths the way he had once counted squad members after a firefight, lips moving silently. He studied what the storm had brought him, a shepherd with a scar cut white through gray ribs that would fill out in time, intelligence clear as speech in her gaze. He studied the rope, too. The dirty fibers, the knot, the way frost had sealed it. Someone had owned her, or at least claimed to. Someone had failed her. Near midnight, the generator hiccuped. The lights dimmed and fluttered to dark. The stove's orange heart became the room's only sun. Jack stood, felt along the shelf for the box of matches, and touched flame to a pair of candles. Shadows reared up the log walls, then calmed. He pulled on his boots, opened the back door, and listened. The generator box sat 30 feet from the porch, a dark mound under a crust of snow. No sound carried except wind and his own breath. He closed the door and slid the bar, a simple habit in storms. He would check the generator at first light. For now, the stove would hold if he fed it right. He settled again, palms open to the heat. Bella drifted into a deeper sleep, pupils sliding under lids, pain dulled by warmth and food and the steady cadence of a man not leaving. Around 2, the wind tired to a lullaby of grit on glass. Jack rose, added a fresh log, and tucked the blanket around Max and Daisy. He noted the tiny scars on their pads, ice cuts, nothing more, and the way Bella's ear twitched when the house creaked. He let himself imagine tomorrow without telling himself he was imagining it. The sky lightening to a smudge, the path he'd shovel from porch to shed, the temporary pen he'd rig from an old crib rail and a broken gate, the phone call he'd make to Tom Miller in town for better feed. Morning would bring decisions. For now, the work was simpler: to be present in the storm and not flinch. Dawn finally pressed pale thumbs against the windows. Snow fell steadier, less angry, each flake a slow parachute. Jack stood, bones answering the hour, and looked down at the small family sleeping inside his parka and wool. He felt the oddest sensation, a shift as quiet as snow settling the cabin felt larger, as if a wall had moved outward. He tucked the rope remnants into a paper bag for later, cleaned his makeshift instruments, and told Bella softly, "You're safe." Her tail brushed the blanket, the smallest motion a flag half raised. In that lean cabin, in that hard winter, the first piece of grace had taken root. Jack Turner kept his chair pulled close to the stove until the first edge of daylight showed faint through the frosted window panes, his body leaning forward as if his presence alone could keep the flame alive. He had survived the war with the instinct that attention to detail kept men breathing, and now that instinct had turned toward the fragile trio on the blanket. Bella lay curled around Max and Daisy, her eyes opening now and then to study him with suspicion softened by exhaustion. The pups whimpered in their sleep, twitching against her chest, and every time one shifted, Jack noticed her ears flick toward the sound. He rose quietly, not to disturb them, and warmed water on the stove, mixing in a pinch of powdered broth so that the smell carried gently through the air. He crouched down again, slid the bowl near Bella, and waited. At first she only sniffed, but then her tongue reached for the water, slow and measured, as if each sip tested his intentions. He noticed the rope burn at her throat more clearly in the morning light. Raw skin rubbed bare where the fibers had bitten into her. The cut had scabbed unevenly, and when she moved her head he could see the stiffness it caused. Jack did not reach for her yet. He let her drink until she turned her eyes back to him, and only then did he lift the shears he had left on the table. He showed them to her, let the metal catch the light, and spoke in the steady low tone that years of command had etched into his voice. "I'll fix it, girl. Just hold still." He reached slowly, felt the rasp of rope against steel, and clipped away the last strand. The remnants dropped onto the floor with a dull sound, and Bella let out a deep breath through her nose, almost a sigh. Jack stroked the fur just above the wound with the back of his fingers, careful not to press. Her body tensed, then released, and that was the first moment he felt she had chosen not to resist him. The pups stirred and wriggled toward him, their small bodies still thin and fragile, their fur damp with melted frost. He gathered them, gently tucked Max under his arm and Daisy against his chest, and both pressed their noses into the folds of his shirt, as though seeking a heartbeat stronger than their own. Their warmth seeped into him, their trust given without question, and he felt a strange pressure in his chest, something both heavy and light, a reminder that life demanded guardians even in a wilderness storm. He set them back with Bella, who raised her head sharply and let out a low growl. He did not flinch. Instead, he reached for a clean towel, dipped it in the warm water, and laid it beside her. "Your turn now," he said softly. She eyed the towel, then him, then lowered her head again as if surrendering to something larger than fear. Jack worked carefully, cleaning the cut on her flank with short, deliberate strokes, pausing whenever her muscles twitched. He had seen men fight against medics with the same instinct, and he had learned that patience broke resistance faster than force. Slowly, the dried blood gave way, the wound revealed as deep, but not mortal. He pressed a bit of ointment into the cut stitched where the skin had separated, and covered the line with a strip of gauze. Through it all, Bella remained silent, her breath hard but steady, her eyes watching every move as though memorizing his rhythm. When it was done, Jack leaned back, wiped his hands on the towel, and let the silence of the cabin settle again. The pups nosed at Bella's belly, eager for milk, and she shifted to allow them close. He turned his gaze away to give them privacy, though he knew animals had no such need. Still, the gesture mattered to him, as if respect were the currency of trust. The stove popped a log, settling into coals, and Jack stood to add another piece of wood. He glanced once more at the rope on the floor, that crude loop that had cut so deeply into her skin, and felt anger flicker under his calm exterior. Whoever had put that rope on Bella had left more than scars. They had left a question he could not yet answer. The storm raged less violently now, but the windows still shook under the force of the wind, and snow stacked higher against the door. Jack knew that the cabin once built as his place of solitude was no longer just his. It had become a shelter for 3 lives that had stumbled into his care, and that meant choices he could not avoid. He fetched a shallow pan from the cupboard, poured in some of the warm milk mixture, and coaxed Max and Daisy toward it. Their clumsy lapping made him smile faintly despite himself. Bella lifted her head, watching him with eyes that seemed both grateful and uncertain. When he knelt near her again, she did not growl this time. Instead, she let her muzzle rest on her paws. Ears tilted forward as though she had weighed the cost, and decided, at least for now, that he was not her enemy. Jack sat back on his heels, the pups nosing against each other. Bella's breathing evening out as sleep tugged at her again. He thought of his cabin as it had been only yesterday, quiet, unbroken by sound except for the creak of wood and the whisper of wind. Now it was filled with life, fragile yet insistent, demanding space and care. The shift was unsettling, but it also filled a hollow he had carried too long. He pulled the blanket higher over them, fed the fire, and told himself he would find proper food and medicine in town once the roads cleared. For now they were alive, and that was enough. As the hours passed, the storm thinned outside, leaving a sky still heavy with gray, but less violent, as though the mountain had decided to rest. Jack checked the door latch, adjusted the shutters, and returned to the chair between stove and blanket. The pups had finished their meal and now lay stretched across Bella's side bellies, round eyes closed in unguarded sleep. Bella opened her eyes one last time, met his, and gave a faint thump of her tail against the wood floor. It was not affection yet, but it was not rejection either. For a man who had lived too long with silence, it was more than enough. Jack Turner rose from his chair after a restless doze, the storm outside having eased to a steady whisper against the cabin walls. The warmth of the fire had filled the small room, carrying with it the scents of pine smoke, damp wool, and animal musk. He crouched again near Bella and her pups, checking the bandages he had set the night before. Bella raised her head, tired eyes following his hands, and he spoke to her in that calm tone he had once used with wounded comrades. "Just a quick look, girl. Hold still for me." The pups stirred but did not cry, their breathing rhythmic and deep as they nestled into the crook of her belly. Jack's fingers brushed gently along the edge of the gauze. The wound was not inflamed, which gave him a measure of relief. Yet the skin around her throat showed raw burn marks from the rope that had cut too long. He thought about the rope, how it had no place on an animal meant to guard or serve, and he thought about the ways men sometimes bound what they did not understand or value. His mind traveled without permission to a night years ago on foreign soil when his unit had been ambushed in an alley where the air smelled of diesel and dust. He had seen Corporal Jenkins push a younger soldier down behind a wall, taking the blast of shrapnel meant for someone else. Jack remembered the sound of it, the suddenness, the way loyalty sometimes meant a life spent in an instant. As he looked at Bella, curled protectively around her pups, ribs pressed tight against theirs, he felt that same instinct of sacrifice mirrored in the silent animal. She had dragged herself through the storm, bleeding, starving, but she had not left them behind. He saw her courage not in what she had done, but in what she had refused to abandon. The weight of memory pressed his chest, as if the storm outside had crept into him. He drew in a slow breath and steadied his hands. To distract his thoughts, he tilted Bella's head gently to check her ears for frostbite. As he parted the fur, his eyes caught something faint on the inner skin, a set of faded numbers inside a small oval mark. It was not military, not a tattoo he recognized from dogs he had seen on bases overseas. The ink was uneven but deliberate, the kind of branding he had heard belonged to large-scale breeders who marked litters for sale. He leaned closer, careful not to startle her, and traced the faint outline with his eyes rather than his touch. It confirmed what the rope and scars had suggested: she had not been raised as a family companion or trained as a working partner. She had been stock cataloged for profit, her value measured in numbers and pedigree charts. Jack leaned back on his heels, his jaw tight, and thought about how many men he had known who had been reduced in the same way: numbers on dog tags, statistics in reports, assets rather than souls. He whispered, "You're more than a number, Bella," and though she could not know the words, she seemed to sense the tone. Her ears flicked once, and her eyes softened, as if something in her had registered his intent. Jack busied himself with practical tasks to keep his mind steady. He boiled water, cleaned the tools he had used, and set aside a ration of oats and dried meat to share with Bella until he could reach town for proper feed. He noticed the way the pups had begun to explore their small blanket world, Max pushing forward with clumsy boldness, Daisy following with hesitant steps. Their tiny paws slipped on the wood floor, and Bella lifted her head sharply whenever they drifted too far, calling them back with a low rumble that carried authority. Watching them, Jack thought again of his squad mates, of how even in the darkest places there had been laughter. Small gestures of protection, the unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. He realized that in caring for Bella and the pups, he was not only protecting them, but also honoring memories he had carried too long in silence. The cabin no longer felt merely like a refuge from snow, but like a temporary field hospital where survival demanded vigilance and compassion. Outside, the wind dropped further, and through a gap in the clouds, the morning light broke pale across the drifted yard. Jack considered venturing to the generator shed to repair the lines he suspected had been damaged, but he hesitated. Something in the neat cut of the wires the night before troubled him. He knew weather could do strange things, yet instinct told him another hand had been involved. Still, he let the thought rest for the moment, focusing instead on the fragile peace inside. He cleaned Bella's ears with gentle care, speaking low to keep her calm. The pups mewled softly, then settled again, their trust absolute. Jack glanced once more at the faint tattoo and knew it meant someone had once claimed ownership over her, someone who might come looking. That thought settled cold in him, colder than the storm itself. He added wood to the stove, folded another blanket for the dogs, and made notes on a scrap of paper about supplies he would need when the road cleared: salve proper, food, thread milk. Each detail anchored him, kept him from drifting too far into memory. He reminded himself that while the past haunted him, the present demanded attention. As evening neared, Bella shifted and placed her head lightly on his boot, not in surrender, but in weary acknowledgement. Jack remained still, honoring the moment. He had once sworn to guard the lives of men beside him. Now he felt the weight of a different oath, unspoken but no less binding. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, and the shutters rattled against the frame. Jack looked at the window, then back at Bella, and the thought of her tattoo returned like a warning. Someone had marked her. Someone had bound her. Someone might come to claim her again. He felt the storm was no longer the only threat pressing against his door. The storm tapered through the night until only a hushed snowfall remained, and when dawn finally came, it revealed the cabin blanketed in white that caught the pale light of morning. Jack Turner stepped onto the porch with a shovel in hand, the kind of tool he had learned to treat as essential as a rifle in winter country. He pushed Snow from the steps and glanced toward the tree line, noting how the drifts leaned against the old split-rail fence. Bella stood just behind him inside the doorway. Her head-tilted ears alert the pups asleep in the cabin on the folded blanket. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, but he welcomed the clarity it brought after a long night of memory and worry. As he moved along the porch, scraping a path, his eyes narrowed at a detail the storm had failed to erase. A line of tracks curved out from the corner of the house toward the woodshed, pressed deep enough to remain clear even after hours of snow. They were not his. He knew the shape of his own boots. These prints were larger, the stride longer, and they came from the direction of the tree line rather than the road. Jack crouched, brushing away a light cover of snow to examine them more closely. Whoever it was had moved slowly, careful but not hurried, and at one point the prints stopped near the window before continuing back toward the trees. Jack's breath clouded before his face as he stood again. He looked to Bella, who had pressed her nose against the crack of the door. Ears pulled forward, her eyes fixed on the same tree line. He felt the weight of her instinct echo his own. Someone had been close in the night, close enough to stand at his window while he and the dogs slept inside. Jack shoveled the rest of the path in silence, but the comfort of his solitude was gone. Every sound of snow sliding from the roof or branch cracking under ice felt like something more deliberate. He returned inside, laid the shovel near the wall, and fed the fire to keep the cabin warm for Bella and the pups. Through the day, he busied himself with tasks meant to push unease aside, cutting more kindling, mending the latch on the back door, and measuring the dwindling stores of flour and coffee. Yet his mind returned always to the tracks. They had not been random wanderers or hunters. They had paused to look into his life. As the sun fell behind the ridge, shadows thickened across the snowfields, and the cabin lights glowed against the encroaching dusk. Jack switched on the generator outside to keep the bulbs steady and the heater in the back room running, and he listened to its steady hum as reassurance. Bella had begun to follow him room to room, testing her strength, with each step her wound mending enough to let her walk without faltering. The pups played on the blanket, their clumsy paws tapping against the wood floor. For a brief moment, the normal rhythm of home settled over them. Then, near midnight, the cabin fell into sudden silence. The lamps flickered once and died, leaving only the orange heart of the stove and the pale moonlight through the frost glass window. Jack set his coffee mug down and listened, his soldier's instinct pulling him upright before his mind had fully grasped it. The generator had gone quiet. He pulled on his boots, took his flashlight from the shelf, and opened the back door carefully so as not to startle Bella. The night air swept in bitter and still. Snow had stopped, and the landscape reflected moonlight in a dull silver wash. The path to the generator shed was short, but each step felt weighted with anticipation. He clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam over the snow, scanning for new tracks. At first there was nothing but the familiar lines of his own work earlier, but near the shed he saw them again, larger boots pressed firm and fresh. His jaw tightened. He pushed the shed door open, the hinges groaning softly, and bent over the generator. The machine was intact, no sign of engine failure or storm damage. Instead, the wires leading from the housing had been cut clean through the copper exposed ends, curling slightly as if sliced with a sharp blade. He felt the stillness around him deepen. This was no accident of ice or weather. Someone had walked up in the dark close to his home and disabled the very thing that kept his cabin alive through the cold. Jack's breath misted in the beam of his flashlight as he straightened. He scanned the tree line again, but saw only the still branches heavy with snow. He returned to the cabin with steady steps, shut the door firmly, and barred it against the night. Inside, Bella had risen, her body angled toward the back door, her hackles raised, though she made no sound. Jack knelt to her level, running a hand along her shoulder, and whispered, "You felt it too." She pressed her muzzle into his palm before easing back toward the pups. Jack lit 2 oil lamps he had kept for emergencies, the soft glow pooling against the log walls, and set them near the blanket so the dogs would not stir at the sudden dark. He sat by the stove with his rifle across his lap. Old habits returning with ease, eyes fixed on the door and ears tuned to the smallest creak. He knew the storm had hidden more than it had revealed. Whoever had marked Bella once might have tracked her to his ridge, and now they had stepped close enough to cut his lines. The question was not if they would return, but when. And Jack understood the night was no longer simply a barrier of snow and wind. It had become a battlefield waiting to be claimed. By the 3rd morning after the storm, Jack Turner knew he had to go into town. His supplies were running thin, and more importantly, Bella needed proper food and medicine that he could not improvise forever. The tracks around his property still troubled him, but the snow on the ridge had settled enough for his truck to make the 20-mile drive to town. He stacked a few logs by the stove, checked Bella's wound once more, and filled a shallow pan with warm milk for the pups. Max and Daisy lapped clumsily while Bella watched her eyes steady on Jack as if she knew he was preparing to leave. He crouched beside her, rested a hand lightly on her head, and said in a low voice, "Stay inside. Keep them safe. I'll be back." She blinked once and pressed her nose against his wrist before lying back down with the pups. Jack layered his clothes, pulled on his heavy parka, and stepped out into the brittle air, the world outside crisp and too quiet. The old pickup roared reluctantly to life after a long turn of the key exhaust spilling white into the morning. He guided it carefully down the ridge road, tires crunching on hard-packed snow, his eyes scanning the tree line out of habit. Each turn of the road carried the sense of exposure, but the drive remained uneventful until the valley opened and the small town of Fair Creek came into view, its wooden storefronts lined with plowed mounds of snow. Jack parked in front of Harris's General Store, a squat building with a hand-painted sign and windows fogged from the heat inside. As he stepped through the door, the warmth and familiar smell of coffee and oiled wood greeted him. Mr. Harris, an older man with silver hair combed back neatly, stood behind the counter, arranging canned goods. He nodded in welcome. "Morning, Jack. Storm treat you rough?" Jack returned the nod, answering simply. Cabins still standing. He took a basket and moved down the narrow aisles, picking up flour-dried beans, coffee, and a few tins of stew. His ears caught the low murmur of voices near the back of the store. He slowed, turning down the next aisle, and let the words come clearer. 2 men he didn't recognize stood near the bulletin board by the stove. They wore new-looking jackets, the kind not common among local ranchers, and their boots were too clean for men who worked the land. One of them held a folded photograph barely visible, while the other asked Mr. Harris in a tone that carried no worry, only calculation. "You seen a shepherd female with 2 pups. Went missing during the storm. Worth a good bit to the right people." Harris shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Haven't seen any strays. Storm kept most animals close to home." The men exchanged a glance, their mouths tight, and one said, "We're paying cash if you hear anything. No questions, just pass along word." They left soon after the bell over the door jingling in their wake, but the air they left behind felt colder than the snow outside. Jack kept his head down, but every word had struck him sharp. He moved to the counter, set down his basket, and met Harris's eyes. The older man's gaze lingered a moment before he began ringing up the items. He spoke in a quieter voice. "Don't know what they're after, Jack, but I don't like the smell of it." Jack nodded slightly, choosing silence, and paid for his goods. As he stepped outside with the bagged supplies, he heard footsteps crunch on the snow behind him. Tom Miller, a stocky man in his 40s, with a weathered face and a steady reputation, came up beside him. "Jack," he said low, "you want to hear something you won't from the sheriff. Those fellas aren't the first. Strangers been hanging around all week flashing money asking about dogs. Some say they're breeders, others think worse, but nobody trusts their story. They've been up and down the valley, and now they're here asking Harris about shepherds." Jack met Tom's eyes, reading the quiet warning there. "You think they'll keep asking?" Tom nodded grimly. "They don't look like the kind who give up. Be careful on that ridge of yours." Jack loaded his supplies into the truck, thanked Tom with a firm handshake, and drove out of town. The road back felt longer, every bend carrying the weight of what he had overheard. He replayed the men's cold voices, the way they had spoken about Bella not as a living creature, but as property. He thought of the tattoo inside her ear, the scar on her flank, and the rope that had bound her. The pieces aligned into a picture he didn't like. Bella had escaped something deliberate, and the storm had not erased her trail completely. Jack pressed his foot harder on the gas as the ridge rose ahead, the truck engine straining against the incline. When he finally pulled into the drive, Bella was at the window, ears forward, the pups visible as pale shapes behind her. He carried the bags inside, set down the food, and crouched beside her again. "They're looking for you," he said softly. And though she could not know the words, her steady gaze made it seem as though she understood. He opened a can of stew, warmed it on the stove, and mixed it with some of the new kibble he had bought. Bella ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and the pups climbed clumsily over each other in their blanket nest. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the kind of silence that felt expectant. Jack knew that the cabin was no longer simply a refuge from weather, but a place that had drawn the attention of men willing to pay and to cut through snow for what they wanted. He checked the locks on the doors, stowed the rifle within reach, and marked the thought in his mind. Strangers had asked in town, and strangers had walked close to his window. The storm had given him Bella and the pups, but it had also brought their shadows trailing behind. Jack Turner guided his truck back into the clearing, the chains on his tires clattering against the hard-packed snow as the cabin came into view. Smoke curled faintly from the stovepipe, proof that the fire he had banked before leaving had held steady. He parked near the woodpile and shut off the engine, listening for a moment to the heavy stillness of the ridge. It was not the peaceful silence he once sought when he first built the cabin. It was sharper, threaded with the unease of knowing others had begun to circle. He carried the supplies inside and was greeted immediately by Bella, who stood near the doorway with her ears forward, her eyes sharp, and her body tense. Max and Daisy stirred on the blanket but did not rise, their small bodies too tired from play to notice the shift in their mother's posture. Jack placed the bags on the counter, crouched down, and reached for Bella's head, but she did not lean into his touch as she had before. Instead, she froze, muscles taut, her gaze fixed on the tree line beyond the window. A low rumble vibrated in her chest, quiet but unrelenting. Jack followed her stare and saw the line of trees swaying lightly in the wind. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then a flicker of movement broke against the uniform white. A dark figure there for only a second, then gone behind a drift. His stomach tightened. He stepped closer to the window, careful not to make sudden movements, and caught a second glimpse. The figure paused just inside the cover of the pines, as if measuring the distance to the cabin. Jack's mind replayed the clean cuts in the generator wires, the strangers' voices in town, and the warning in Tom Miller's eyes. He knew then that this was not imagination or the tricks of Snowlight. Someone had followed the trail here. He turned slowly back to Bella, who had shifted her weight forward, body lowered, ready to protect. Jack whispered, "Easy, girl. Stay with them." He crossed to the rifle rack, lifted the old hunting rifle, and checked the chamber. He had carried it countless times through the woods for deer, never against another man, but the heft in his hands now felt grimly familiar. He took one step toward the door, and that was when the glass shattered. A sharp crack tore through the night, the unmistakable report of a rifle echoing down the ridge. The kitchen window burst inward, shards scattering across the counter, and a ceramic jar sitting by the sink exploded into fragments, the contents spilling in a cloud of dust. Bella leapt back with a sharp bark, shielding the pups with her body. Jack dropped low, heart-hammering, pulling the rifle close against his shoulder. The shot had not been meant to kill. The aim was too deliberate, too precise, striking a harmless target, yet sending a message clear as words: "We know you are here and we can reach you." Jack stayed crouched, eyes scanning the window for any second movement. The night outside had turned hostile, every drift and shadow a possible vantage point. He exhaled slowly, willing his breathing to steady. He crawled to the edge of the window, careful to keep low, and peered through the jagged glass. The tree line was still, yet he felt the watcher's presence. He had lived too long with the knowledge of how it felt to be sighted down the barrel of a scope. He backed away, keeping the pups in his periphery, and moved to the stove where Bella had corralled them. She pressed her body tight against theirs, her eyes never leaving the door. Jack laid a hand on her back, grounding her as much as himself. "They're testing us," he said in a hushed tone, "seeing if we'll break." He moved quickly through the cabin, dousing the lamps to reduce the glow that made them targets. The fire in the stove still burned, but its light was low, casting long shadows rather than bright pools. He placed the rifle against the table, unrolled a wool blanket, and pressed it into the shattered window frame to keep the wind and snow from pouring in. His motions were practiced, not frantic, the same discipline he had carried through nights of uncertainty overseas. He paused to listen again. Only the moan of wind and the shifting creak of pines answered. Whoever had fired had chosen not to press further, at least not yet. Jack returned to the pups, who whimpered quietly but did not stray from Bella's side. He stroked Daisy's back, feeling the tiny heart fluttering beneath her ribs, and felt his own chest tighten. The rifle shot had not harmed them, but its intention had pierced the fragile bubble of safety he had been trying to build. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It had become a mark. He fed Bella a portion of the stew he had carried from town earlier, coaxing her to eat despite the tension in the air. She accepted it reluctantly, swallowing with her eyes still darting toward the windows. Jack sat by the stove with the rifle close, watching the flames shift lower. He thought of the tattoo in Bella's ear, the men in the store, and the boot prints pressed into snow around his home. He knew then that the strangers were not just looking. They had found him, and they wanted Bella back. The night stretched long, but no more shots came. Jack did not sleep, only watched and listened, his body taut as wire, his mind marking every creak of the cabin as a possible step outside. By dawn, the snow had stopped, leaving the landscape washed clean, yet scarred with the memory of gunfire. Jack looked at Bella, who finally eased her head onto her paws, exhaustion overtaking vigilance. He reached for the stove, added a log, and told himself the fight had only begun. Jack Turner did not sleep after the shot that had broken his window. He spent the remainder of the night listening to the timbers creak and the wind shift his rifle never more than an arm's length away. When dawn finally arrived and sunlight spilled faint over the ridge, the cabin looked calm, but Jack trusted the calm as little as he trusted the silence of a battlefield after gunfire. Bella lifted her head before he moved, ears pricked as though sensing his thoughts. Max and Daisy stirred in their blanket nest paws, twitching as if already preparing to follow her. Jack stood, buttoned his parka, and strapped on his boots. "We're checking the ground," he said quietly, though the words were more for himself than the dogs. Bella rose and pressed her nose against the door seam, her tail low ready. Jack opened the door carefully and stepped into the frozen air. The snow had crusted overnight, firm enough to hold his weight without sinking too deeply. He moved in slow arcs around the cabin, his rifle slung, but his eyes sweeping every drift and shadow. Bella padded close at his side, had lowered every muscle tight with purpose. Max and Daisy trotted behind, mimicking her posture with surprising precision. For pups so young, their bodies crouched low as though instinct told them this was no ordinary walk. Jack noted each detail, the fresh snow piled against the porch, the shattered glass glittering beneath the window frame, and the trail of prints that disappeared toward the tree line. He crouched to examine them more closely, brushing away ice with his glove. The impressions were sharp, pressed deep by heavy boots, and the stride showed a man accustomed to moving through rough ground. He scanned the horizon, but the forest revealed nothing. They moved down toward the slope where the creek cut through the valley, its surface frozen in a pale ribbon that glinted under the weak sun. Jack paused at the edge, watching the dogs fan out naturally. Bella took the lead, circling, while Max and Daisy followed in smaller loops, their paws crunching softly on the snow. He could not help but notice the discipline in their movements. Even in play, they stayed within sight of one another as though some invisible cord bound them to a pattern of watch and response. The creek bed bore more than ice and drift. Jack saw the broken line of tire tracks pressed into the snow where no vehicle should have traveled. The marks curved down from the ridge, cut across the frozen creek, and vanished into the woods on the far side. He crouched, tracing the grooves with his glove, and felt the unease in his gut deepen. The tracks were fresh, likely made within the last day. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line beyond. That was when he saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney of an old hunting cabin half hidden among the pines. The building had stood empty for years, as far as Jack knew, a place hunters once used but long since abandoned. Now its roof bore fresh snow, but its chimney carried a steady plume of gray proof that someone had claimed it again. Bella stiffened at his side, her eyes fixed on the distant shape. Max let out a small growl that surprised Jack with its seriousness, and Daisy pressed closer to her mother, her ears twitching. Jack lifted his rifle and peered through the scope, though the distance made it hard to see clearly. No figures moved outside, but the smoke told enough of a story. Whoever had fired that warning shot, whoever had cut his generator, now had shelter less than a mile from his home. He felt the weight of the discovery settle into his chest. The cabin was no longer surrounded by emptiness. It was being watched from within, shouting distance. Jack lowered the rifle and crouched near the dogs. He stroked Bella's head, steadying her, and whispered, "We know where they are now." He considered his options, each one heavy. Confrontation meant danger, but ignorance was no longer possible. He studied the tracks again, following their line until they disappeared into the brush. Whoever had driven here had done so quietly, leaving no sign visible from the road. This was planned, not chance. Jack looked back toward his own cabin perched on the ridge. It seemed smaller now, fragile against the weight of eyes that might be measuring its defenses. He turned the group back, keeping his pace deliberate. Bella walked close her steps, soundless, while Max and Daisy fell in behind, still mimicking her caution as though they understood the gravity of the moment. When they reached the yard again, Jack ushered the dogs inside, barred the door, and set the rifle on the table. He spread a map across the wood, marking the creek and the hunting cabin in his mind. He could not let fear dictate his choices, but neither could he pretend this was coincidence. The enemy was near waiting and perhaps deciding their next move. Bella lay down by the fire, her eyes still fixed on the door as though she too knew the perimeter had been breached. Jack felt the familiar hum of readiness settle into his bones, the same hum that had carried him through patrols overseas. He had not chosen this fight, but it had come to his doorstep all the same. The smoke from the hunting cabin haunted Jack through the rest of the day. He tried to busy himself with repairs and firewood, but every swing of the axe brought the image back, a hidden fire, burning less than a mile from his own home, fed by men who wanted Bella and her pups. At dusk, he stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, watching the valley dim under the fading light. The thought pressed harder in his mind. He needed help, but he had few he could trust. His eyes fell on the old radio in the corner of the cabin, the one he had used during blizzards to reach town when the lines went down. He switched it on, turned the dial until the static cleared, and called for Deputy Collins. Collins was younger, steady, and one of the few in law enforcement Jack had spoken to since choosing his solitude. They had shared a moment years back, pulling a car from a ditch during an ice storm, and Jack had carried respect for him since then. After a pause, the radio crackled with Collins's voice. "Jack, is that you? Everything all right up there?" Jack leaned close, his tone low but firm. "Not exactly. Strangers are prowling. I found a camp near the creek. They've already taken a shot at the cabin." A long silence followed, broken only by static. When Collins spoke again, his voice carried hesitation that Jack had never heard before. "Look, Jack, I'll be straight. I've been told to advise you. These men, they're connected. If you hand over the dogs, this ends. No more threats, no more trouble." Jack's hand tightened on the receiver. "You're telling me to surrender them?" The deputy's answer came softer, as though spoken with eyes averted. "Sometimes peace comes from letting go. They're not worth dying over." Jack's chest hardened at the words. "They're worth more than you know," he said quietly, and without waiting for a reply, he switched the radio off. The silence in the cabin afterward felt heavier than the storm outside. Bella stood near the table, her gaze fixed on him as if she had caught the edge in his voice. Max and Daisy stirred in their blanket, the innocence of their movements a painful contrast to the betrayal Jack felt. He poured kibble into a dish, mixed it with some of the stew from the pot, and set it down for Bella. She stepped forward slowly, her body easing for the first time that day, and bent her head to eat. As she shifted under the lantern light, Jack's eyes caught something new along her side. A long, pale line, barely visible under her thick coat, ran from her ribcage down toward her hip. He knelt and brushed the fur aside gently. It was no scratch from brambles or scrape from ice. It was a scar, clean and deliberate, the mark of a blade that had cut deep and healed only through time and endurance. His hand lingered there, trembling slightly. Bella stopped eating and lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes held no fear, only a weary patience, as though she had carried that scar longer than memory could hold. Jack felt the air thicken in his chest. She had not only escaped confinement, but survived cruelty far sharper than rope. He let his hand rest against her side, whispering, "You've fought harder battles than this." Max tottered closer, pressing his small muzzle against Bella's shoulder, and Daisy soon followed, nudging at her flank. They gathered against her as if the scar were simply another part of her, accepted without question. Jack sat back on his heels, watching them together, and realized the pups were already learning strength from her survival. The betrayal of Collins still burned, but Bella's scar reshaped it into something deeper. He could not rely on lawmen who counseled surrender, nor could he trust town whispers. What he could trust was here in the cabin, the loyalty of a wounded mother, the resilience of her pups, and the instincts that had kept him alive through worse nights. He added another log to the fire, listening to the pop and crackle, and thought of the men in the hunting cabin. They had no idea what Bella had already endured, or what she had become by surviving it. Jack sat through the evening, sharpening his knife and cleaning the rifle, his motions deliberate, his thoughts steadying. The scar reminded him of men he had known overseas who carried marks of their own silent evidence of cruelty overcome. Those men had taught him that scars were not just reminders of pain, but proofs of resilience. Bella was proof standing there alive against all that had tried to break her. As the night deepened and the cabin settled, Jack drew a blanket around his shoulders and watched the dogs sleep. Bella lay with the pups pressed against her side, the firelight casting a faint glow on the scar hidden beneath her coat. Outside, the ridge was still, but Jack no longer measured the threat only in tracks and smoke. He measured it in the test of endurance that was coming. He whispered to himself a promise if men had already scarred Bella once, they would not be allowed to take her again. The night pressed close around the cabin, heavy with silence, broken only by the faint whistle of wind over the ridge. Jack Turner sat in the armchair with the rifle balanced across his knees, the fire in the stove glowing low but steady. He had not slept much in days, and yet fatigue never seemed to dull his senses. The scar on Bella's side haunted him, a reminder of cruelty survived, and it had shaped his resolve into something immovable. He had told himself that when danger came again, he would not hesitate. Bella stirred before he did. She rose from the blanket where the pups lay, nestled, ears, pointed muscles tightening into a line of readiness. Jack followed her gaze to the window and then heard it himself. The faint mechanical hum carried across the snow. It grew clearer with each breath, no longer just the moan of winter, but the rhythm of engines. Snowmobiles. Jack moved quickly, dousing the lantern and checking the rifle. Bella pressed herself in front of Max and Daisy, her body forming a shield, her chest low but steady, a growl rumbling like thunder from deep within. Jack looked through the crack of the shutter and saw them at last, 4 snowmobiles cutting arcs across the valley, their headlights dimmed, but not enough to hide the shapes of men bundled in heavy coats circling, closing in. The tracks he had found at the creek had not been idle scouts. They had been the first mark of what was now unfolding. Jack whispered to Bella stay close and positioned himself at the front door. The cabin walls felt suddenly thin, the logs not as solid against this kind of siege. He watched the machines spread out, forming a half-circle around the clearing. Engines cut off, and the silence that followed was sharper than the sound itself. He counted their silhouettes moving among the trees, at least 5, maybe more. Then came the crunch of boots in snow, deliberate, moving closer. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle, waiting. Bella stood against his leg. Max and Daisy huddled tight behind her, their small bodies trembling, but their eyes fixed on their mother. A sudden noise snapped from the back of the cabin, a faint scuff of wood, and Jack realized too late that while he watched the front, someone had slipped to the rear. He turned, but the latch of the back door gave a sharp crack as a figure forced it open. Before Jack could bring the rifle around, Bella launched forward. She struck the intruder with the full force of her body, a blur of fur and teeth. The man stumbled, arms flailing his weapon clattering to the floor as Bella drove him backward into the snow outside. Jack rushed in, behind Boots, slamming the door shut before another could follow. The distraction bought him precious seconds. He swung the rifle toward the front window just as another shadow broke from the tree line, testing his defenses. Jack fired a warning shot into the snow at the man's feet, the crack of the rifle rolling across the ridge. The figure froze, then ducked back toward the trees, clearly shaken by the accuracy. Outside, another snowmobile engine roared to life, circling to sow confusion, but Jack's eyes stayed sharp, his training returning with every breath. He moved from window to window, tracking movement, while Bella returned inside, fur-bristling muzzle flecked with snow, her eyes still locked on the rear door, as though daring it to open again. Max and Daisy whimpered, but stayed pressed against the wall, their gaze following their mother, as if her courage was enough to keep them still. Jack reloaded calmly, counting his rounds, listening to the rhythm of footsteps as the strangers tested every side of the cabin. He shouted through the walls, his voice low but carrying. "This place is mine. Come through the door again and you won't walk away." The words hung in the cold air, and though the men did not answer, he sensed their hesitation. For nearly an hour the standoff stretched, broken only by the crunch of boots shifting positions and the occasional growl from Bella. Each time a shadow drifted near, Jack shifted with it, his rifle steady, his eyes refusing to blink. Finally, as the moon lifted above the ridge, the snowmobiles roared again, pulling back one by one. Their engines faded into the valley until silence returned. Jack stood still for a long time, waiting, unwilling to believe they were gone. Only when Bella eased her growl into a quiet pant did he lower the rifle. He checked the pups, stroked Bella's head, and whispered, "You saved us again." He knew this was no victory, only a reprieve. They had tested his resolve, seen the strength of the defense, and would return better prepared. But tonight he and Bella had held the line, and for the moment that was enough. The hours after the attackers pulled back passed in a haze of watchfulness. Jack Turner remained at the window with his rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the tree line, ears tuned to every whisper of the wind. Bella lay near the pups, still alert, her body angled toward the door, unwilling to let her guard down. Max and Daisy had finally drifted to sleep, curled against their mother as if her steady breathing could erase the terror of the night. Jack did not sleep. He sat with his thoughts heavy, his muscles taut, his mind rehearsing every possibility of their return. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the ridge, he had convinced himself they might strike again with the rising sun. Instead, the sound that reached him was different. Not the whine of snowmobiles, but the measured crunch of heavy boots and the low hum of an engine far steadier than any raider's machine. Jack straightened rifle raised until he saw what emerged from the trees. A convoy of vehicles, painted in the muted colors of authority, rolled carefully into the clearing. At their head was a state trooper cruiser, its lights turning silently in the morning haze. Jack's breath released in a slow cloud when he recognized the tall figure stepping out. Trooper Daniels, a man he had met years earlier during a wildfire evacuation, now stood before the cabin. His hat pulled low, his uniform marked by frost. Daniels lifted a gloved hand, his voice steady, but carrying. "Mr. Turner, we had reports of shots fired up here. Are you all right?" Jack lowered the rifle but kept his stance firm. "We're alive. They came in the night. Snowmobiles. Tried to take the dogs." Daniel's eyes shifted to the shattered window. The snow still churned near the back door and the dark stains of boot prints circling the cabin. He nodded once and signaled to the officers behind him. They spread out in practiced formation, moving toward the tree line, weapons ready. Within the hour they returned, leading 3 men in heavy coats with their hands bound, the remnants of arrogance gone from their faces. One of the officers held up documents and photographs taken from their packs, lists of animals, prices, and destinations. Daniels's voice hardened as he showed Jack. "It's a trafficking ring. They've been running stolen dogs across state lines for months. Someone must have lost hold of your shepherd and they were desperate to bring her back." Jack's eyes fell to Bella, who stood in the doorway, her scar catching the morning light. She had not been lost. She had escaped. Daniels added, "They'll face charges. We'll follow the trail higher. But you, Mr. Turner, you did right to hold your ground." Jack nodded, words caught in his throat. He had fought through storms and silence for years, but never for something that mattered quite like this. By mid-morning, the troopers were gone, leaving quiet in their wake, but this time the silence did not feel hostile. Jack walked through the cabin, slowly repairing what he could. He swept the glass from the floor-hammered boards across the broken window and patched the back door where the intruder had forced his way in. Bella followed, not hovering, but present, as though claiming the cabin as her own now as much as his. When Jack finished, he cleared a corner near the stove, lined it with old blankets, and built a wooden frame for shelter. He carried Max and Daisy there himself, setting them gently in their new nest. Bella tested it with a careful step, sniffed the blankets, then lay down her pups, climbing over her side with delighted yips. Jack watched the scene with a weight lifting from his chest he had not realized he carried. Weeks passed, the storm gave way to clearer skies, and life began to take shape again. Jack repaired the cabin walls with fresh timber, built a sturdier pen outside for the dogs to roam, and stacked his woodpile higher than before. Bella's coat grew glossy with rest and proper food, her scar fading under her fur, but never gone a quiet reminder of her endurance. Max and Daisy grew quickly, their steps surer each day, their play filling the cabin with noise Jack had once sworn to avoid. Yet he found himself smiling at their clumsy antics, even laughing softly when Daisy stole a glove from his workbench or Max barked at his own reflection in the window. At night, Jack no longer sat with the rifle alone. He sat with Bella beside him, her head resting on his knee while the pups curled against his boots. He spoke to them without fear of silence, telling stories of men long gone, of deserts and ridges, and the lessons of loyalty he had learned too late. The cabin, once a fortress against loneliness, had become a home alive with breath and warmth. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the valley, Jack stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. Bella stood at his side, Max and Daisy tumbling in the snow near the woodpile. The world was still, but no longer empty. He looked down at Bella and whispered, "We made it." She lifted her head, eyes steady, ears turning toward the pups as they yipped in play. For the first time in years, Jack felt not just safe, but whole. He had saved them, but they had saved him in return, pulling him back from a silence that might have swallowed him forever. The storm had broken, the danger had passed, and in its place stood a man, a mother, and two growing pups, each scarred, each stronger, and each bound together by loyalty no stranger could take away. That was Jack's story, a veteran, a mother shepherd, and two pups who turned survival into something greater. What moment struck you the most? Was it the first rescue in the storm, or the night when strangers surrounded the cabin? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll bring you more powerful stories of loyalty and hope.